Дом, в котором стало слишком тихо. The house was look perfect from the outside. Clean lines, warm lighting, a neatly trimmed yet everything carefully arranged to give the illusion of a life that made sense. But inside it felt different. Almost hollow. Like sound itself had learned to write these walls. At first, I tried to convince myself it was normal. That every marriage eventually settles into something quieter, something less intense. But here is a difference between peace and emptiness. And I learned to recognize it in the way footsteps don't take anymore. In the way conversations end before they even begin. My husband was rarely home. Work, meetings, sudden trips was something urgent. Always something more important than waiting on the table. I was set to ask questions. Then I stopped. Not because I understood, but because I got tired of hearing half answers spoken without looking at me. The evenings were the worst. That was when the house became too large for one person to live inside it comfortably. The ticking clock in the kitchen sounded louder than it should have. The refrigerator hummed like it was trying to fill the silence out of pity. Even a moon movements pouring tea, walking across the floor, closing a door felt exaggerated, as if I were the only actor left on an abandoned stage. Sometimes I would see by the wind and watch the street outside. Neighbors coming and going. Laughter from distant hums. Cars pulling in. Doors opening. Families disappearing inside warm light. Life happening everywhere except here. And I would ask myself a question I never said out loud. Когда именно мы перестали быть мы? When did us turn into two separate lives sharing the same address? There were no fights anymore. No dramatic arguments. No loud endings. Just a slow fading. The kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind you only notice when you realize you haven't been truly seen in a long time. I still remember one evening when he came home briefly. He didn't even take our witch's coat fully. Just stood near the doorway, checking his phone while speaking in short, distracted sentences. I asked him about Witch's Day. He nodded without listening. And then he left again. No goodbye that felt like it meant anything. After that night, something inside me stopped expecting things. Not hope exactly. More like anticipation. Even disappointment requires expectation. And I was learning how to feel neither. The silence in the house began to change shape. It wasn't just absence anymore, it became presence. Heavy. Noticeable. Almost alive. Тишина в доме была такой, будто она стала третьим человеком между нами. I started leaving the television on just to write me tea. Not because I was watching, but because at constant how clearly I could hear myself think when everything else stopped. Then came the day everything shifted slightly. It wasn't dramatic. No warning. No emotional storm. Just a decision I didn't fully understand yet. Dobberman. I remember the first moment I saw him clearly. Not soft, not gentle, not trying to please anyone. Just standing there with a calm, controlled intensity. As if he understood boundaries better than people did. He didn't fill the house with noise. He changed the silence. And somehow, that felt worse and better at the same time. Because for the first time in a long while, central on anxiety. Он пришел в нашу жизнь неожиданно. And it didn't happen the life usually changes no warning. No conversation, no preparation. One day the house was still the same quiet, heavy place, and the next, there was something else inside it. Here I would do without ceremony. No excitement. No gentle introduction. Just a presence that entered the space as if it already belonged there. Dobberman. The first time I saw him up close, I felt something close to hesitate not fear exactly, but respected me it with uncertainty. He wasn't the kind of animal that asked for approval. He didn't fear to be liked. He simply was. Standing still, perfectly controlled, eyes alert, watching. And for a moment, I didn't know where to look. There is a specific kind of silence that follows a strong presence like that. Not empty silence but focused silence. As if the air itself becomes rawer. I remember thinking, he sees everything. And my husband barely reacted when he brought him home. A short explanation. Something about security, protection, practicality. Words delivered quickly, without emotional weight. Like adding a new piece of furniture to a house already full of invisible distance. But this was not furniture. This was rudeness. At first, I kept a my distance. I would walk past him carefully, always aware of each gaze following me. Not threatening. Not aggressive. Just attentive. And that attention felt unfamiliar in a way it don't explain. Because I wasn't set to being noticed anymore. In my life with my husband, I had slowly learned how to exist quietly. To reduce myself into routines and silence so undisturb whatever word he was constantly rushing toward. But this dog he didn't ignore me. He observed every movement, every pause, every shift in my tone. It was unsettling and strangely comforting. One evening, I dropped a glass in the kitchen. It shattered loudly against the floor. I froze immediately, expecting irritation or interference, or nothing at all like usual. But before I could even bend down, he was there. Not panicked, not chaotic, just present. Standing between me and the broken glass as if assessing the situation, not reacting to it. I remember holding my breath. And then I realized something strange. I wasn't afraid of him. I was afraid of how quickly I trusted him. Days passed like that. Sly adjustments. Silent observations. Small changes I didn't announce to myself. He started following me from room to room not in any way, but as if it was simply natural for him to stay nearby. When I sat down, he would lie at a distance that felt intentional. Not invading. Not leaving. I was exactly where I could feel him without being covered and be with him. It was the first time in a long while that silence didn't feel like abandonment. It felt shared. And then came the moment I noticed the shift inside me. I was standing by the window one evening, watching the street like I always did. That familiar ache was there again, the quiet reminder of how little of my life felt answered. But this time, something changed behind me. I didn't need to turn around to know he was there. I could feel it. That steady presence. That attention. That awareness of me. And I realized something I wasn't ready to admit out loud. I wasn't invisible in this house anymore. When I finally did turn, he was watching me. Calm. Still. Focused in a way that felt almost too precise. As if he was trying to understand something no one else had ever bothered to notice. And I remember thinking, almost painfully clear. Я боялась его взгляда, пока не поняла, что впервые за долгое время меня действительно замечают. That was the moment everything began to shift. Not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly. Like a door opening inside a house that had been closed for far too long. Муж, который всегда был где-то далеко. The strongest thing about human difference is that it doesn't happen all at once. Эти райвы слали, полетели, almost respectfully. Like it doesn't want to disturb the life it's taking apart. At first, I told myself nothing had changed. He was just busy. Work was demanding. Responsibilities were heavy. Had thought I was set to believe. But belief and truth are not the same thing. Truth starts showing itself in small moments. In the way conversations become shorter. In the way silence becomes longer. In the way someone stops asking how you're on because they forget, but because their reasons and don't matter. Am my husband still cold? Sometimes. But those calls didn't feel like connection anymore. They felt like updates. Like checking boxes on a list that had nothing to do with emotion. How are things? Fine. Good. И be later again. That was it. No pause. No curiosity. No softness between the words. Just sensation. I started noticing how quickly I learned to respond. Not to express, but to finish the conversation efficiently. As if even he had adapted to his absence. And after every call, the house felt quieter than before. Because now I had something to compare it to. The Dobberman. He didn't speak. He didn't call. He didn't explain anything. But he stayed. And somehow, that silence felt more honest than the conversations I was having. There were evenings where I would sit on the couch, phone in hand, hearing my husband's voice through a speaker or earpiece, and I would glance across the room. He would be there, watching, not interrupting, not reacting, just present in a way that didn't demand anything from me but also didn't ignore me. And I started to feel something uncomfortable. Current person. Not something I chose. Something that happened to me. Because one presence made me feel like I was part of a schedule. And the other made me feel like I was part of a word. I remember one evening clearly. My husband called later than usual. His voice started. Distracted. I asked him when he'd be home. There was a pause, not emotional. Just logistical. I don't know yet, he said. I let you know. Let you know. Not come home. Not miss you. Just notify. After the call ended, I didn't move for a long time. The phone was still in my hand, but I wasn't looking at it anymore. Because I realized something simple and painful. I wasn't waiting for him the way I said to. Not with hope. Not with expectation. Just habit. And habits die quietly. Behind me, I felt movement. The Dobberman shifting slightly, adjusting its position. His eyes still on me. No pressure. No demand. Just awareness. It was strange how different that felt. One absence made me feel forgotten. The other presence made me feel seen without asking for anything in return. And I began to understand the real danger as in the silence in the house. It was the contrast. Because once you notice the difference between being tolerated and being noticed, you can't unsee it. I started catching myself in moments I didn't recognize. Waiting for the sound of a kiss not because I wanted him back, but because I wanted proof that something still belonged to me. But even that expectation started fading. Because the Dobberman didn't disappear. He didn't delay. He didn't postpone a presence. He simply was there. Always. And slowly, without me realizing when it started, I stopped running towards the sound of absence and started noticing the weight of presence. One night, I sat near the window again, watching the empty street, phone untouched beside me. My husband was late again. Or maybe not coming home at all that night. I didn't even ask anymore. Behind me, I felt that steady presence again. Calm. Certain. Unchanging. And I found myself thinking something I didn't say out loud. How can someone feel so close when they don't speak, and someone else feel so far away even when they do? The answer didn't come. But the question stayed. And for the first time, I didn't push it away. Когда взгляд говорит больше, чем слова. There are emotions that don't need language. They don't fit into sentences. They don't survive explanations. They simply exist, quiet, and impossible to hide. And somehow, hell is not just term before I did. It started with small things. A longer sound than usual. A slower movement across the room. The way I would sit without really sitting like my body was present. But my mind had already left somewhere else. He learned me in ways I never taught anyone else. Not through words. Through observation. One evening, I remember standing in the kitchen with nothing in my hands, just staring at a cup of tea I never drank. And my husband had cancelled our not to return home. Nor apology that felt real. Nor dream seeing his voice. Just another daily did to a life full of terror. I didn't see her at first. I didn't react at all. That was the problem. The silence inside me had become so practiced that even pain had learned how to sit quietly. But he noticed. Of course he did. The Dobberman appeared at the edge of the room, not rushing, not forcing attention, just entering my space like he already understood it. He changed. I didn't look at him immediately. I told. Because I already knew what I would see. That steady focus. That awareness. That quiet resignation of something broken without needing proof. And when I finally sat down on the floor, I didn't even realize I was falling apart until I couldn't hold myself together anymore. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet. The kind of breaking that doesn't ask for help because it forgets help exists. I pressed my hand against my face, trying to steady my breathing. Trying to make it stop. Trying to make myself normal again. And then I felt him closer. Not touching. Not overwhelming. Just close enough that the space between us disappeared in a way I could feel without looking. I remember thinking I should push him away. I remember not doing it. Because for the first time in a long time, I wasn't performing strength for anyone. And he didn't expect me to. He didn't question it. He didn't demand I explain why I was like this. He just stayed. Minutes passed. Or maybe longer. Time doesn't behave the same way when someone is sitting beside you. Silence instead of trying to fix it. At some point, I realized that my breathing hit slot. Not because I forced it, but because something in me stopped resisting. And that was the moment I understood something dangerous. Not love. Not dependence yet. Something quieter. Relief. He didn't ask what was wrong. He didn't try to fill the silence with words that would miss the point. He simply existed beside it, as if it was allowed to exist. And I found myself speaking. Not fully formed thoughts. Just fragments. Pieces of things I had never said out loud. About feeling forgotten. About feeling like a shadow in my own marriage. About the strangulonaliness of being technically not alone. And he listened the only way he could. Without interrupting. Without misunderstanding. Without leaving. When he finally stopped talking, I expected emptiness to return. But Natty didn't. Something else stayed. Warm. Quiet. Present. And I heard myself whisper without meaning to. Он не спрашивал, что случилось. Он просто оставался рядом. И этого было достаточно. After that night, I started noticing it more. Whenever I withdrew into myself, he followed not intrusively, but inevitably. As if distance was something he refused to accept between us. And slowly, without me realizing it was happening, I stopped turning inward alone. Because there was someone there now. Not fearing me. Not judging me. Just staying. And in a life where absence had become normal, that presence began to feel like the only truth I could trust. Подозрение, которое нельзя было объяснить. At first, he didn't say anything. But I felt it before he ever put it into words. That shift in there when someone starts noticing something they don't understand. And decides it must mean something wrong. And my husband came home earlier than expected that night. No warning. No message. Just the sound of the door opening like a decision already made. I was in the living room. The Dobberman was there too. Not doing anything unusual. Just lying near me, calm and still, as if he belonged to the advantage of the house more than the house itself. But the moment my husband saw us together, something in each expression changed. It wasn't anger at first. It was confusion. That slow emotion that arrives before judgment. He looked at me. Then at the dog. Then back at me again. Like he was trying to connect that didn't belong on the same page. Interesting, he said finally. Just one word. But Nitty didn't feel neutral. It felt loaded. I asked what he meant. He didn't answer immediately. He took our cheese cut slowly, too slowly, as if buying time to shape that out properly. And then he said it. You spent a lot of time with him. Not a question. A statement disguised as observation. I didn't respond right away. Because I didn't understand what he was really asking. Time. Yes. I spent time with the only presence in the house that actually stayed close enough to feel real. But I didn't say that. Instead, I said nothing. And silence. Sometimes answers for you in the worst way possible. I chose eyes moved back to the Dobberman again. Longer this time. He didn't like what he saw there. Or maybe he didn't like what he thought it meant. You talk to him, he added. Now there was something sharp underneath his voice. Still controlled. Still calm. But not neutral anymore. I felt something tighten inside me. Because it wasn't true the way he imagined it. And yet it was true in a way it sounded explain without sounding like I was defending something wasn't supposed to have. I just. Quieter. Relief. He didn't ask what was wrong. He didn't try to fill the silence with words that would miss the point. He simply existed beside it. As if it was allowed to exist. And I found myself speaking. Not fully formed thoughts. Just fragments. Pieces of things I had never said out loud. About feeling forgotten. About feeling like a shadow in my own marriage. About the strangulonaliness of being technically not alone. And he listened the only way he could. Without interrupting. Without misunderstanding. Without leaving. When he finally stopped talking, I expected emptiness to return. But Natty didn't. Something else stayed. warm, quiet, present. And I heard myself whisper without meaning to. Он не спрашивал, что случилось. Он просто оставался рядом. И этого было достаточно. After that night, I started noticing it more. Whenever I withdrew into myself, he followed not intrusively, but inevitably. As if distance was something he refused to accept between us. And slowly, without me realizing it was happening, I stopped turning inward alone. Because there was someone there now. Not fearing me. Not judging me. Just staying. And in a life where absence had become normal, that presence began to feel like the only truth I could trust. Подозрение, которое нельзя было объяснить, at first, he didn't say anything. But I felt it before he put it into words. That shift in there when someone starts noticing something they don't understand. And decides it must mean something wrong. And my husband came home earlier than expected that night. No warning. No message. Just the sound of the door opening like a decision already made. I was in the living room. The Dobberman was there too. Not doing anything unusual. Just lying near me, calm and still, as if he belonged to the architecture of the house more than the house itself. But the moment when my husband saw us together, something in each expression changed. It wasn't anger at first. It was confusion. That slow emotion that arrives before judgment. He looked at me. Then at the dog. Then back at me again. Like he was trying to connect that didn't belong on the same page. Interesting, he said finally. Just one word. But it didn't feel neutral. It felt legit. I asked what he meant. He didn't answer immediately. He took our cheese cut slowly, too slowly, as if buying time to shape that out properly. And then he said it. You spent a lot of time with him. Not a question. A statement disguised as observation. I didn't respond right away. Because I didn't understand what he was really asking. Time. Yes. I spent time with the only presence in the house that actually stayed close enough to feel real. But I didn't say that. Instead, I said nothing. And silence. Sometimes answers for you in the worst way possible. I chose eyes moved back to the Dobberman again. Longer this time. He didn't like what he saw there. Or maybe he didn't like what he thought it meant. You talk to him, he added. Now there was something sharp underneath his voice. Still controlled. Still calm. But not neutral anymore. I felt something tighten inside me. Because it wasn't true the way he imagined it. And yet it was true in a way it sounded explain without sounding like I was defending something wasn't supposed to have. I just spent time with him, I said quietly. He nodded once. But it wasn't agreement. It was conclusion. And that was worse. Later, after he went upstairs, I stayed in the living room longer than usual. The Dobberman hadn't moved. He was watching me, not reacting to the tension, but roar of it. As if he understood that something in the atmosphere had shifted into something heavier. I reached down and touched his fear absent-mindedly. A grounding history. Something real in a space that suddenly didn't feel stable. And I realized something uncomfortable. I'm a husband hunt as to what I felt. He had only interpreted what he saw. And what he saw didn't match my truth at all. The next days became colder. Not dramatically. Not openly. But in the small gaps between words. In the way he stopped sitting near me for long. In the way his questions became shorter, sharper, more indirect. As if he was building a theory instead of trying to understand a person. One evening, he finally said it out loud. You're getting attached to him. The way he said, him wasn't neutral. It wasn't about a dog anymore. It was about a competitor. I almost left. Not because it was funny. Because it was absurd. But I didn't laugh. Because I could feel the tension underneath it wasn't about the Dobberman at all. It was about absence finally being noticed. Too late to control it. I looked at him and said nothing. Because anything I could say would be misunderstood anyway. And then he did quietly, almost like an accusation he had been rehearsing. You changed since he came into this house. That or changed indeed differently than he expected. Because he was right. But not in the way he thought. He'd changed because he'd finally started noticing how invisible he'd been before. And standing there, between misunderstanding and silence, I realized something painfully clear. He wasn't jealous of the dog. He was jealous of the attention I no longer had to beg for. And for the first time, I saw our marriage not as distance, but as misinterpretation. And that was where the real tension began. Ночь, когда все изменилось, that night didn't feel different at first. It began like all the others squared, controlled, almost carefully normal. The kind of normal that isn't peaceful, just привычная тишина. The kind you stop questioning because questioning had mean admitting something is wrong. My husband came home late again. He didn't announce it. He never really did anymore. The sound of the door was enough. A short, mechanical moment that marked his return without ever truly bringing him back into the house. He barely spoke. I barely asked. We had both learned how to exist in the same space without intersecting. That was the strange part. Not fighting. Not arguing. Just absence with walls round it. I was in the kitchen when I heard him upstairs. A drawer closing. Footsteps. A pause long enough to feel intentional. Then silence again. And somewhere in that silence, something inside me shifted. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just emphatic turning into weight. The Doberman was lying near the hole. As always. Watching. Not intervening. Not reacting to anything its own define. But present enough that I felt anchored without realizing I needed anchoring. I sat down on the kitchen floor without thinking. It wasn't a decision. It was a collapse that disguised itself as rest. My hands were still. My breathing wasn't. And suddenly, everything I had been holding together for months, maybe years, stopped pretending it was stable. It came out in pieces. Not words at first. Just sounds pressury behind my eyes. A tightening in my chest that didn't ask permission. And then it broke. Quietly. No screaming. No dramatic moment. Just tears that felt overdue. I pressed my hand against my mouth, trying to stop it, trying to make it small enough to ignore. But the house didn't allow that anymore. Because now, I wasn't alone in it. He was there. I didn't need to look to know. The Doberman moved closer slowly, deliberately, as if understanding that sudden movement would make everything worse. And I remember thinking. Something strange even in that moment. He always knew not to disturb me. That thought hit harder than expected. Because I realized that I had spent so long in a house where no one wanted to stay. And now I hit someone who did. I leaned more forward against my knees, trying to breathe through it. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was shared. And that made it bearable. At some point, I whispered without meaning to. I can't do this anymore. My voice sounded чужой to me. Like it belonged to someone who had been waiting too long to be heard. Behind me, I felt him sit closer. Not touching. But close enough that I could feel the presence of understanding without it becoming intrusion. And I broke a little more after that. Because I realized that I wasn't speaking to my husband upstairs. I wasn't even thinking about him in that moment. I was reacting to the fact that I had stopped expecting him to come down emotionally, even when he was physically in the house. And that realization hurt more than any argument could have. I sat there for a long time. Minutes stretched. Or maybe hours. Time didn't matter in that space anymore. What mattered was the absence of expectation. Eventually, I wiped my face, slowly, like I was returning to something fragile. And I said it quietly, not to the room, not to him upstairs, but to the space between everything. Я поняла, что в этом доме я уже давно разговариваю не с ним, а с тишиной. The words didn't feel like drama. They felt like clarity. And clarity, once it arrives, doesn't ask permission to stay. Later, I found myself sitting on the couch. The house was still the same house. But wasn't the same person and city. The Doberman lay near me, come again, as if nothing had happened because for him, maybe nothing had changed. But for me, something irreversible had shifted. Not between me and him. Between me and everything I had been pretending was still connected. And in that quiet aftermath, I finally understood. The distance in my marriage started the day I noticed IT. IT had started long before that. I had just learned to live inside IT. Until now. Граница, которую я больше не видела. After that night, something in me stopped behaving the way it used to. Not dramatically. Not in a way no one else would notice. But inside. Everything felt slightly misaligned. Like a life that had been originally wasn't looking. The morning still came. The house still functioned. And my husband still existed in it. In fragments phone calls, short appearances, brief exchanges that felt more like updates than connection. But I wasn't receiving him the same way anymore. It was as if a thin layer had lifted from my perception. And now I could see the structure underneath. And I didn't like what I saw. Because once you notice emotional distance clearly, it stops feeling normal. The Dobерман stayed close that morning, as always. Calm. Observant. Anchored in a way that didn't demand attention. But somehow always held it. And I began to notice something unsettling. Not each is be here. Mine. I was waiting for him. Not in the way you wait for a person. In the way you notice absence only because presence has become familiar. And that realization made me pause. Because I don't remember when that shift happened. When silence stopped feeling like emptiness. And started feeling like something I could recognize. One afternoon, I was standing in front of the mirror. Not really looking at myself. Just existing in reflection. And I caught myself thinking something I immediately tried to reject. This feels more real than everything else in my life right now. And I didn't know it, this was. That was the problem. There was no clear definition anymore. No line between comfort and dependency. Between presence and attachment. Between emotional safety and emotional replacement. Everything had started blending. Softly. Quietly. Dangerously. Later that day, my husband spoke to me again. It wasn't a conversation. It was an observation disguised as concern. You've become distant, he said. I almost left again. Because the union was unbearable. Distant. As if distance was something I had suddenly invented alone. As if it hadn't been growing between us for years, carefully, consistently, without interruption. I didn't answer him immediately. And in that pause, I realized something even more. Uncomfortable. I didn't know what close with him would even look like anymore. That thought stayed with me longer than his words. That evening, I found myself sitting on the floor again. Not because I was breaking this time, but because sitting upright felt unnecessary. The Dobерман was nearby. Watching. Not intervening. Just present in that steady, familiar way that no longer surprised me. And I caught myself doing something I hadn't done before. I turned toward him before I turned inward. Not for answers. Not for language. Just for presence. And that scared me more than anything my husband had ever said. Because I was starting to measure emotional reality differently. Not by what was said, but by what stayed. And what left. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to organize my thoughts, trying to separate a feeling from interpretation. But there was no separation anymore. Everything was overlapping. Memory. Emotion. Routine. Silence. And him. Always him. I whispered without intending to. I don't understand what's happening to me. Nancy came in words. Only presence. And some fear. That felt like enough. But also too much. Because I could feel the boundary set to realm between normal attachment and something deeper starting to blur in a way its own reverse. And I finally admitted something I had been avoiding even in my own mind. Я больше не понимала, где заканчивается одиночество и начинается привязанность. The sentence didn't solve anything. It only made the confusion clear. That night, I lay awake longer than usual. The house was quiet again, but not empty in the same way anymore. Now it felt layered. Like two realities existing at once. One where I was still a wife in a distant marriage. And another where I was slowly becoming someone else entirely. And I didn't know which one was real anymore. Правда, которую нельзя вернуть назад. There are truths that don't rise floweredly. They don't break doors open or shake the ground beneath you. They simply settle inside your life, quietly. Until one day you realize you can no longer live without noticing them. That's what happened to me. Nothing dramatic changed overnight. А my marriage didn't їх плоде. There was no final argument that ended everything in a single moment. No clear ending that would make things easier to explain. Life doesn't offer that kind of clarity. It just continues. But it changed. And once you change in a quiet way, there is no way back that feels honest. And my husband was still there. In the same house. In the same routine. Moving through days like he was had. As if nothing had shifted at all. But I was no longer inside that version of life in the same way. I could see it now. The distance wasn't new. It had always been there. I had just learned how to name it. The Доберман status here was дітком, steady, present without demanding anything in return. Not filling space with noise. Not trying to replace anything. Just existing in a way that made absence feel more visible than before. And I realized that something I had resisted understanding for a long time. He didn't take anything from my life. He revealed what was already missing. One evening, I found myself sitting near the window again. It had become a habit, the squared observation of a world that continued moving normally outside while mine felt slightly ranged inside. And my husband was working later again. Or maybe I just didn't ask anymore. That difference mattered more than I wanted to admit. The Dobberman lay beside me. And for the first time, I wasn't thinking about the contrast between him and silence. I was thinking about what he had changed in me. Not a my circumstances. A my awareness. Because before him, I had learned to tolerate emotional distance as if it was normal. I had turned absence into routine. I had mistaken quiet for stability. And I had stopped asking myself whether I was truly seen. Now I knew the answer. And knowing it didn't hurt in a sharp way. It hurt in a clear way. The kind of clarity that doesn't focus on, but isn't excuse anything either. I reached down and placed my hand lightly on him. Not out of need. Just recognition. A quiet acknowledgement of everything that had shifted without permission. And I thought about the life I had before all of this. It didn't feel fake. It just felt incomplete in a way I'd been able to recognize at the time. Because you don't notice emotional absence while you're inside it. You only notice it when something else shows you what presence can feel like. I whispered it without meaning to. Not as a confession to anyone, but as an acceptance to myself. Он не изменил мою жизнь, он просто показал, какой пустой она была до него. And for the first time, that thought didn't feel like betrayal. It felt like understanding. Not everything has to be replaced. Not everything has to be destroyed to be seen clearly. Sometimes, something simply reveals the truth you are already living inside. Later that night, I stayed awake longer than usual. The house was still the same house. But it no longer felt like a single story. It felt like two truths existing side by side. One that continued because it had always continued. And one that had quietly reckoned because it could no longer pretend. And I didn't know what happened next. But I understood something I couldn't unlearn anymore. You don't always lose people when you change. Sometimes, you just finally see what was never really there in the first place.